If you make a sound, the bullet won't be the worst part. Cliff Rains had built his empire on the principle that fear was currency. Tonight he learned terror had a different exchange rate. The hand that clamped over his mouth smelled of lemon polish and desperation. It belonged to Mary Shirley, a woman whose face he couldn't recall despite 4 years of her moving through his mansion like smoke. Her silver eyes blazed with an urgency that froze the protest in his throat as she dragged him sideways into the cramped linen closet beneath the grand staircase. Hey everyone, welcome. I'm so grateful you're here for today's story. If these tales of betrayal, survival, and unexpected allies speak to you, if you love stories where the overlooked become unstoppable, then smash that subscribe button right now. We're growing a community of people who believe the best stories come from the shadows, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. One click, one subscription, that's all it takes to be part of this journey. Now let's get into the story. Through the slats of the closet door, Cliff watched his world invert. Silas Crane, his trusted advisor, the man who had stood beside him through 6 territorial wars, poured himself a glass of Cliff's vintage bourbon. But it was the woman beside Silas that made Cliff's blood turn to ice water. His sister, Bianca, her fingers intertwined with Silas's, laughing softly at something whispered in her ear. "The car?" Bianca asked, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans. Silas held up a small black device. "Vaporized. They'll be scraping what's left of him off the driveway for weeks." The click of the detonator echoed through the foyer. A heartbeat later, the windows rattled with a thunderous explosion that shook dust from the chandelier. Cliff's Bentley, the one he should have been sitting in, erupted into a fireball visible through the front windows. Orange light danced across Silas's satisfied smile. Mary's hand pressed harder against Cliff's mouth, and he realized with sickening clarity that his legs were shaking. Not from fear but from something else. Something wrong. His vision blurred at the edges and a metallic taste coated his tongue. "The cologne worked perfectly," Bianca said, raising her glass in a mock toast. 3 months of Maid's ruin, and the devil of the coast can barely hold a gun steady. Cliff's hand dropped instinctively to his hip. His custom Beretta was gone. He looked down at Mary, who met his gaze with those piercing silver eyes and slowly shook her head. She held up his weapon, then pointed 2 fingers at her own eyes, then at the floor above them. "Guards. Everywhere. Bought." Cliff Rains had never known what it felt like to be powerless. Every breath now was a reminder. The toxin that had been seeping into his system through his daily cologne burned through his nervous system like acid. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his legs felt disconnected from his body, and the edges of his vision flickered like a failing television signal. Mary didn't wait for permission. She pulled him from the closet the moment Silas and Bianca moved toward the study, navigating him through passages he didn't know existed in his own home. Service corridors, hidden behind false walls and decorative panels. Routes that allowed the invisible people of his household to move unseen. Mary knew every corner, every loose floorboard, every door hinge that needed oil. She understood the architecture of his empire better than he did, because she had built her survival on being unnoticed. They had just passed the auxiliary kitchen when Cliff heard the sharp bark of a walkie-talkie ahead. Mary shoved him into a narrow alcove behind an industrial laundry cart, her body pressed against his to keep him upright as his legs threatened to give out. Through the gap between the cart and the wall, Cliff saw 3 of his own security detail sweep past, assault rifles at the ready, searching for something. Searching for him, though they didn't know it yet. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps every face he'd trusted was now his enemy. When the footsteps faded, Cliff tried to speak, tried to assert some control over the nightmare his life had become. "My car, the garage has. Your cars have tracking systems." Mary cut him off, her voice no longer the meek whisper of a servant. "Every vehicle, every phone, every watch you own broadcasts your location. Silas has access to all of it. Do you want to escape or do you want to hand him a map?" Cliff wanted to argue. He was the devil of the coast. He didn't flee through service corridors like a common criminal. But his body betrayed him, a wave of vertigo crashing over him so violently that only Mary's slender frame kept him from collapsing. She stripped him methodically. His phone dropped into a trash compactor, his Patek Philippe watch tossed into an industrial sink filled with bleach, even his diamond cufflinks removed and scattered. Every piece of his identity, every symbol of his power, discarded like garbage. They emerged into the night through the kitchen's loading dock, and the salt air of the coastal cliff hit Cliff like a physical blow. Rain had begun to fall, cold and relentless, turning the narrow path that hugged the cliff's edge into a treacherous ribbon of mud and stone. Below, waves crashed against jagged rocks with a violence that promised a quick death to anyone who slipped. Mary took his weight without complaint, guiding him along the path with the confidence of someone who had walked it 1,000 times in darkness. Cliff stumbled, his expensive Italian shoes slipping on wet stone, and realized with bitter irony that the woman he'd walked past without acknowledgement for 4 years was now the only thing standing between him and oblivion. "Why?" he managed to gasp, his voice raw. "Why are you doing this?" Mary didn't look at him. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, scanning for threats, calculating each step. "Because, Mr. Rains, you're the only person who can sign the papers to free my father from prison. And I've spent 4 years becoming invisible in your house, waiting for the moment when you'd need me more than I need you." In the distance, sirens wailed. Searchlights from the estate began sweeping the grounds. And Cliff Rains, the man who had never needed anyone, realized he was entirely at the mercy of a ghost he'd never bothered to see. They walked for an hour along the cliff path, Cliff's condition deteriorating with each step. By the time the old lighthouse emerged from the fog, its paint peeling and windows dark, Cliff could no longer feel his legs. Mary half-dragged him up the weathered steps, and as the door closed behind them, shutting out the sound of distant sirens, Cliff collapsed onto the cold stone floor. "Welcome to the Salt Sanctuary," Mary said quietly, kneeling beside him as his vision began to fade. "This is where the invisible people of your city come when they have nowhere else to go. You're one of us now, Mr. Rains. Let's see if you survive long enough to appreciate the irony." The rain turned vicious as they left the estate's manicured grounds behind. What had been a steady drizzle became sheets of water that obscured everything beyond 10 feet, which Mary seemed to consider a blessing. She kept one hand locked around Cliff's wrist, the other occasionally reaching out to trace the cliff wall as if reading braille in the stone. The path narrowed to barely 3 feet wide, with nothing but a sheer drop to the churning Atlantic on their right. Cliff's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration violent against his thigh. Mary stopped so abruptly he nearly crashed into her back. She turned, silver eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the storm, and held out her hand palm up. "No words. Just expectation." "I need it," Cliff said, hating how his voice shook. "I can call people who what? Who haven't already chosen Silas's money over your life." Mary's voice cut through the rain like a blade. "That phone is screaming your location to every cell tower between here and the harbor. It's a beacon, Mr. Rains. And right now you're prey, not predator." Behind them, searchlights from the estate swept across the cliff tops, great mechanical eyes hunting through the darkness. Sirens wailed closer now, multiplying, converging. Cliff heard the distinct whump-whump of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. Silas wasn't taking chances. He was mobilizing everything. Cliff pulled the phone from his pocket, the screen bright with notifications. Missed calls from numbers he recognized, contacts he'd cultivated over decades. His thumb hovered over Bianca's name, some primal part of him still refusing to believe his own sister had become his executioner. Mary snatched the phone from his trembling hand and hurled it over the cliff edge without ceremony. Cliff watched the glowing screen tumble through the darkness, swallowed by the void. "Your watch," Mary said, already reaching for his wrist. "This was my father's. Your father's dead. You want to join him, keep arguing." She twisted the Patek Philippe free with surprising strength, examined it briefly in the rain, then sent it following the phone into the abyss. "The vintage cars, the watches, the legacy. That's who you were yesterday, Mr. Rains. Today you're a man with neurotoxin eating his nervous system, hunted by people who know every move you've ever made. Your past is weight. Drop it or drown in it." A spotlight swept over the cliff face 30 yards behind them, and Mary yanked Cliff forward with sudden violence. They moved faster now, Mary practically dragging him as his legs struggled to obey commands his brain sent. The toxin was accelerating, each step requiring conscious thought. Left foot. Right foot. Don't look down. Don't think about the drop. Don't think about Bianca holding that detonator. The path curved sharply, following the natural contours of the cliff, and Cliff's shoe caught on loose gravel. He pitched sideways, the black emptiness of the ocean rushing up to meet him. But Mary's hand clamped onto his jacket with the grip of a woman who'd spent years carrying things heavier than her frame suggested possible. She hauled him back against the stone wall, both of them gasping. "You with me?" she demanded, her face inches from his. Cliff nodded, tasting blood in his mouth. He must have bitten his tongue. "Good. Because we're not even halfway there, and if you fall, I'm not going down with you." They continued in silence, broken only by the storm and the distant sounds of the manhunt. Cliff had never walked this path, had never even known it existed despite owning the estate for 12 years. But Mary moved with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every escape route from a place that was never truly home. She was a ghost learning to haunt her own prison. The helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight turning the rain into silver needles. Mary pressed Cliff flat against a shallow depression in the cliff wall, covering his expensive suit jacket with her body as if her blue uniform could somehow camouflage them both. The light swept past, lingered, then moved on toward the harbor. When Mary finally pulled back, Cliff saw something in her expression he couldn't quite name. Not compassion. Not even pity. Perhaps recognition. She'd been invisible for so long that making herself seen, even to save his life, seemed to cause her physical pain. "Half a mile more," she said quietly. "Then you can collapse all you want." Cliff pushed off the wall, his vision swimming, and followed the ghost who'd decided he was worth saving. Behind them, his empire burned. Ahead, somewhere in the storm, lay a lighthouse he'd never noticed and a future he couldn't begin to imagine. The lighthouse materialized from the fog like a monument to neglect. Paint peeled from its cylindrical walls in long strips, revealing rust-stained concrete beneath. The lens housing at the top sat dark and lifeless, its glass panels filmed with decades of salt residue. A chain-link fence that might have once kept people out now hung open, the padlock rusted through. Cliff had driven past this point 100 times on his way to the harbor meetings, had probably signed the city ordinance that declared it condemned, and had never once considered that people might still inhabit it. Mary produced a key from her uniform pocket, which struck Cliff as somehow more disturbing than anything else that had happened tonight. This woman had planned for this. Had prepared a sanctuary while serving him breakfast, while pressing his shirts, while existing in the margins of his vision. She'd been waiting for his empire to crumble, and she'd built an escape hatch in its shadow. The door groaned open on hinges that screamed neglect. Inside, the air smelled of brine and mildew, but also something else. Coffee. Recent coffee. Someone had been here recently maintaining this place. Mary guided Cliff through a narrow entry hall where water stains mapped decades of storms on the walls, then up a short flight of stairs into what must have been the keeper's quarters. The room was sparse but functional. A camp stove sat on a metal table. Battery-powered lanterns hung from hooks screwed into the walls. A cot with folded blankets occupied one corner, and medical supplies, bandages, bottles, equipment Cliff couldn't name, were organized with military precision on makeshift shelves. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a bunker. "How long have you been preparing this?" Cliff asked, but his words came out slurred, as if his tongue had grown too large for his mouth. Mary didn't answer. She was already moving, lighting lanterns that cast the room in harsh white light. Cliff tried to take another step toward the cot, but his legs simply stopped obeying. Not weakness this time. Complete disconnection. He looked down at his expensive shoes, sent the mental command to move forward, and watched as absolutely nothing happened. The floor rushed up to meet him. He didn't feel the impact, didn't feel Mary catching his shoulders to break his fall. He felt only the terror of a man who'd just lost control of his own body, the neurotoxin finally claiming its full prize. "I can't feel my legs," Cliff said, and hated the panic that bled through each syllable. "I can't, they're not." "I know." Mary was suddenly everywhere at once, rolling him onto his back, elevating his legs on folded blankets, checking his pulse with fingers pressed against his throat. Her silver eyes had gone clinical, calculating. The Maid's ruin works in stages. First the tremors, then the blurred vision, then full paralysis of the extremities. "You've been inhaling it for 3 months. Your sister was very patient." Cliff tried to sit up and discovered his arms were weakening too, the numbness creeping upward like frost. "How long? How long until? Until it reaches your diaphragm and you suffocate?" Mary pulled a bottle from the medical supplies, something clear with a handwritten label. At the concentration she was using, maybe 48 hours. Maybe less if your system is compromised. But that's assuming we do nothing, and I didn't drag you through a storm to watch you die in my lighthouse, Mr. Rains. She knelt beside him, uncapping the bottle. The smell that wafted out was astringent, medicinal, almost violent. This is going to hurt. The toxin bonds to your nerve receptors, and flushing it means forcing your body to metabolize poison it was never designed to process. You're going to seize. You're going to vomit. You're going to feel like you're dying because part of you will be. Cliff looked up at her, this woman whose name he'd learned only hours ago, this ghost who held his life in her calloused hands. Why are you doing this? Mary's expression didn't soften. I told you already. You're going to sign the papers that free my father. But you can't sign anything if you're dead. She tipped the bottle toward his lips. Now drink or I'll pour it down your throat. Either way, the next 24 hours are going to be hell. The liquid burned going down and Cliff tasted bitter herbs and something metallic underneath. Within seconds his stomach cramped violently. Mary was already positioning a bucket beside his head, her movements efficient and utterly devoid of sympathy. Welcome to the Salt Sanctuary, she said quietly as the first wave of convulsions began. This is where invisible people come when they have nowhere else to go. You're one of us now, Mr. Rains. Let's see if you're strong enough to survive it. Outside, the storm hammered against the lighthouse walls, and somewhere in the distance, sirens continued their endless wailing search. Time became meaningless in the Salt Sanctuary. Cliff existed only in waves of agony that crested and broke with brutal regularity. His body convulsed with such violence that Mary had to wedge folded blankets around him to keep him from rolling off the cot. He vomited until nothing remained in his stomach, then continued retching, his abdominal muscles cramping so hard he thought his ribs might crack. Mary never left. She stayed in the circle of lamplight, her silver eyes tracking every symptom, every tremor. When the convulsions peaked, she turned him on his side so he wouldn't choke. When his fever spiked, she pressed cold compresses to his forehead and neck, the cloths coming away warm within minutes. When he begged for water, she gave him only small sips, measured and controlled, murmuring that too much would trigger another round of vomiting. Why aren't you sleeping? Cliff managed to rasp during a brief lull, watching her grind something in a mortar and pestle, her movements methodical despite obvious exhaustion. Because if you stop breathing, I need to know immediately. She didn't look up from her work. The toxin suppresses your respiratory system. If I'm not watching, you could simply stop. The casual way she said it, the clinical detachment, somehow made it more terrifying than any threat Silas had ever delivered. This wasn't cruelty. This was triage. She was keeping him alive not because she cared whether he lived, but because his death would make her father's freedom impossible. Around what might have been 3 a.m, though Cliff had no way to verify, the seizures intensified. His back arched off the cot, every muscle in his body locked rigid, his jaw clenched so tight he tasted blood from where he'd bitten through his cheek. Mary's face appeared above him, her hands firm on his shoulders, pressing him down with surprising strength. Breathe, she commanded, her voice cutting through the roaring in his ears. Cliff, breathe through it. Your body is fighting the poison. Let it fight. No one had called him Cliff in years. Always Mr. Rains or boss or sir. Hearing his name spoken without deference, without fear, by a woman he'd treated as furniture, it anchored him somehow. He focused on her face, on those silver eyes that reflected the lamplight, and forced air into his lungs in short, desperate gasps. When the seizure finally released him, he collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked sheets, trembling uncontrollably. Mary was already moving, heating something on the camp stove. The smell that filled the room was earthy and bitter, like wet soil and crushed roots. Drink this, she said, returning with a tin cup that steamed in the cold air. Cliff's hands shook too badly to hold anything. Mary slid behind him on the narrow cot, propping him against her shoulder, and brought the cup to his lips. The liquid tasted like dirt and desperation, but he swallowed because the alternative was dying alone in a lighthouse he'd condemned, saved by no one. My father taught me about poisons, Mary said quietly, still holding him upright as he drank. He was a botanist before you had him arrested for theft he didn't commit. He worked in your estate's conservatory, maintaining those exotic plants you never looked at. He knew which ones healed and which ones killed. She paused, tipping more of the bitter tea into Cliff's mouth. Ironic, isn't it? The man you destroyed gave me the knowledge to save you. Cliff wanted to argue, wanted to defend the decision he'd made 6 years ago when evidence had pointed clearly to her father. But another wave of nausea crashed over him, and Mary was already reaching for the bucket, holding his head as his body purged itself again. The night stretched on with no sense of dawn approaching. Cliff drifted in and out of consciousness, always surfacing to find Mary still there, still watching, still grinding herbs or heating water or checking his pulse with fingers pressed against his wrist. Once, he woke to find her slumped in a chair beside the cot, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, finally asleep. But even in sleep, one hand remained stretched out, 2 fingers resting lightly against his forearm, monitoring his heartbeat through touch alone. When gray light finally filtered through the lighthouse's salt-crusted windows, Cliff managed to turn his head toward Mary, who was awake again, heating more tea. His legs remained dead weight, unresponsive, but the worst of the convulsions had passed. He could think clearly for the first time in hours. "Thank you," he whispered. Mary glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Rains. You're alive, but you're not fixed. And out there," she gestured toward the window where helicopters could still be heard in the distance, "they're still hunting. We've survived one night. Let's see if we can manage a second." Cliff woke to silence. Not the absence of sound but the removal of chaos. No convulsions. No fever burning through his veins. No desperate gasping for air that wouldn't come. Just silence, and the distant crash of waves against the rocks below, and pale afternoon light filtering through windows he hadn't noticed were crusted with decades of salt. His legs still refused to move. He tried flexing his toes, sending the mental command down pathways that seemed to terminate somewhere mid-thigh. Nothing. But his arms responded when he tested them, weak as a newborn's but functional. He managed to push himself up on his elbows, his vision swimming only slightly, and found Mary sitting on the floor across the room, her back against the curved lighthouse wall. She wasn't watching him. Her silver eyes were fixed on something in her hands. A photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. Even from this distance Cliff could make out 2 figures. A younger Mary, maybe 16, standing beside a man with kind eyes and soil-stained hands. Her father. The botanist Cliff had sent to Rikers Island for 15 years. "You're awake," Mary said without looking up, as if she'd sensed the change in his breathing. She slipped the photograph back into her uniform pocket with the care someone might handle a religious relic. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been poisoned and dragged through hell." Cliff's voice came out hoarse, damaged. "Which I suppose is accurate. Your legs. Still gone." Mary nodded, unsurprised. "The paralysis will take longer to reverse. Days, maybe a week. The toxin damaged the nerve sheaths. They need time to regenerate." She stood, moving to check something on the camp stove, and Cliff noticed she was still wearing the same blue uniform from the night before, now stained with sweat and vomit and God knew what else from the herbal remedies she'd forced down his throat. "Why?" Cliff asked. The question had been building since he'd regained consciousness, pushing against his teeth like something alive. "Your father. I know who he is now. James Shirley. I sent him to prison for grand larceny. He was accused of stealing a collection of rare orchids worth $500,000 from my conservatory." "He didn't steal them," Mary said flatly, not turning around. "But you didn't care about that, did you? Someone had to pay for the loss and my father was convenient. He had the access. He had the knowledge. And he was nobody, just staff, just another invisible person maintaining things you owned but never actually looked at. Then why save me?" Cliff pushed himself up further, his arms trembling with the effort. "Why not let Silas finish what he started? Let me die in that closet, or better yet, let me die here where no one would ever find my body. You could have watched the devil of the coast suffocate in his own vomit and called it justice." Mary finally turned, and her expression held something Cliff couldn't quite parse. Not anger, though that would have been justified. Not compassion, though she'd shown him mercy when mercy was the last thing he deserved. Something colder. Something calculating. "Because dead you're worth nothing to me," she said simply. "Alive you can sign a pardon. You can clear my father's name, get him released, give me back the only family I have left." She crossed the room, standing over the cot, looking down at him with those piercing silver eyes. "I don't need you to feel guilty. I don't need your apologies or your redemption arc. I need your signature on legal documents, And I need you alive long enough to provide it. That's it? That's the only reason. Cliff studied her face, looking for cracks in the armor. You spent 4 years invisible in my house, learning every passage, every exit, preparing this sanctuary, keeping me alive through a night that should have killed me, all for a signature? My father is 72 years old, Mary said quietly, and for the first time, something raw bled through her clinical detachment. He has diabetes they barely treat in Rikers. He's lost most of his teeth. He writes me letters in handwriting that gets shakier every month, and every time I visit there's less of him. He's dying in there, Mr. Rains. Dying for a crime he didn't commit, convicted on evidence your security chief probably planted because someone needed to be blamed and my father was easy. She paused, her jaw tightening. So yes, I saved you for a signature. I kept you breathing because you're the only person with the authority to undo what you did. Don't mistake pragmatism for forgiveness. I would have let you choke on your own tongue if there was any other way to free him. The honesty of it was more brutal than any threat Silas had ever made. Cliff realized he'd been expecting some narrative of redemption, some moment where the maid revealed a secret nobility that transcended revenge. But Mary surely wasn't interested in his soul. She wanted his name on paper, and everything else, the rescue, the medicine, the sleepless vigil, was simply means to that end. What happens after? Cliff asked. After I sign whatever you need signed? After your father walks free? Mary's smile was thin and joyless. Then, Mr. Rains, you're on your own. But first you have to survive Silas long enough to hold a pen. And right now you can't even stand. She moved toward the window, peering through a gap in the weathered curtains. They're still searching. 3 patrol boats in the harbor, helicopters every few hours. Your sister gave a very moving interview on the morning news about the tragic loss of her beloved brother. How moving! She cried. Very convincing tears. Mary let the curtain fall back into place. She's quite good at this. Makes me wonder how long she's been planning it. Outside, a helicopter passed close enough that Cliff could feel the vibration through the lighthouse walls. Mary didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited until the sound faded into the distance. Get some rest, she said, turning back toward him. Tomorrow we start physical therapy. You need to be able to walk before you can reclaim anything. The rain returned that evening, drumming against the lighthouse with renewed fury. Mary had moved Cliff to a sitting position against the wall, propped by folded blankets that smelled of mildew and old wool. His legs dangled uselessly over the edge of the cot, foreign objects attached to his torso by spite and failing biology. She was preparing something on the camp stove, the smell of broth mixing with the ever-present scent of salt and decay. Tell me about the day, Cliff said. His voice was stronger now, though it still carried the rasp of a man who'd screamed his throat raw. The day I sent your father to prison. Mary's hands stilled on the ladle. She didn't turn around. Why? Planning to apologize? That won't change anything. I want to understand what I did. What I signed without thinking. Without thinking. Mary laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a sharp edge that could draw blood. That's the problem, isn't it, Mr. Rains? You never thought about it at all. She poured the broth into 2 tin cups, carried one to Cliff, then settled on the floor across from him, cradling her own. You want the story? Fine. I'll give it to you. She took a sip, her silver eyes distant, focused on something 6 years gone. It was May 14th. I remember because it was my 17th birthday and my father had promised to take me to the botanical gardens in the city after his shift. He'd been working in your conservatory for 8 years by then. Not just maintaining it, building it. Every rare specimen, every climate-controlled section, every irrigation system. That was his design, his passion. You signed the checks, but he created the sanctuary. The orchids, Cliff said quietly. The Phalaenopsis rothschildiana collection. 5 plants, worth $600,000 according to the insurance valuation. They went missing on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, your head of security, Marcus Keller, had built a case against my father. Mary's grip tightened on the cup. Convenient timeline, wasn't it? The same Marcus Keller who was fired 3 months later for embezzlement. But by then my father was already in Rikers and no one cared about revising history. Cliff's stomach turned, and for once it wasn't the residual toxin. Keller planted the evidence. Keller sold the orchids to a private collector in Hong Kong and needed someone to take the fall. My father had access, knowledge, and no family wealth to afford a real lawyer. I was 17 with nothing but a public defender who showed up drunk to the arraignment. Mary's voice remained steady, clinical, but her knuckles had gone white around the cup. You never attended the trial. Never looked at the evidence yourself. You just signed the papers your lawyers put in front of you and moved on with your empire building. My father was a line item. An inconvenience resolved. What happened to you after? I aged out of high school with nowhere to go. My father's conviction made it impossible to get decent work. Who trusts the daughter of a thief? So I learned to be invisible. I took jobs where no one looked at faces. Cleaning services, catering companies. Eventually I worked my way into your estate through a staffing agency. She met his eyes. 4 years ago. I walked into your house with one goal. Get close enough to the man who destroyed my family that when the opportunity came I could make him fix it. You've been planning this for 4 years? Planning? Oh. Waiting. There's a difference. Mary set down her cup. I didn't know Silas would try to kill you. I didn't engineer this situation. But I prepared for chaos because chaos was inevitable in your world. I mapped every exit, cultivated relationships with people you never saw. The night guards, the kitchen staff, the groundskeepers. I learned which of your cars had GPS, which phones could be tracked, where the security cameras had blind spots. I became a ghost in your house because ghosts can move through walls. She pulled the photograph from her pocket again, the one of her and her father, and held it so Cliff could see it clearly. The man in the image had laugh lines around his eyes, dirt under his fingernails, and his arm wrapped around a teenage Mary who smiled without the weight of 6 years of bitterness. This is who he was before you took him away. James Shirley. A man who could identify 300 species of orchids by scent alone, who taught me the Latin names of plants before I learned to read, who never raised his voice even when Keller fabricated evidence and you rubber-stamped his destruction. And now he's 72 years old, dying in a cell, while the man who actually stole those orchids probably spent the money years ago. Mary's voice finally cracked, just slightly. So no, Mr. Rains. I didn't save you out of love or nobility or some belief in your fundamental goodness. I saved you because you are the only person with the legal authority to issue a pardon, to clear his record, to give me back what you stole. You're a tool. A very expensive, very complicated tool that I've spent 4 years learning how to use. Cliff absorbed this, the broth growing cold in his hands. What do you need from me? Specifically. First, you survive. Second, you sign an executive pardon for James Shirley, which you have the authority to do as a sitting member of the city's Justice Oversight Committee. Yes, I know about your political appointments. Third, you provide a written statement admitting the investigation was flawed and Keller's evidence was compromised. That gives us grounds for exoneration. And fourth. Mary's smile was cold. You never forget that you owe me a debt greater than any you've ever collected in your criminal empire. Your life, Mr. Rains. I own it now, at least until my father breathes free air again. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor, and Cliff understood with perfect clarity that he wasn't being saved. He was being held ransom by a ghost he'd created. Mary produced a battery-powered television from somewhere in the lighthouse's depths. A small portable thing with a cracked screen and antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. She positioned it on the metal table where the camp stove had been, adjusting the antenna until the static resolved into a grainy image. The evening news. Channel 7, which Cliff knew was in his pocket, or had been until yesterday when everything he owned stopped belonging to him. You need to see this, Mary said, her voice flat. You need to understand what they're doing. The anchor's face filled the screen, appropriately somber. Behind her, a photograph of Cliff. His official portrait from the Harbor Commission, taken 3 years ago when he still believed power meant invincibility. The caption beneath read, Coastal Kingpin killed in tragic accident. Authorities are investigating the death of prominent businessman Clifford Rains, whose vehicle exploded outside his coastal estate late Thursday evening. While initial reports suggest mechanical failure, sources close to the investigation indicate foul play has not been ruled out. The feed cut to the scene outside his mansion. Police tape. Scorch marks on his pristine driveway. The twisted skeleton of his Bentley being loaded onto a flatbed truck. Cliff's hands clenched involuntarily and Mary noticed but said nothing. Then the camera found Bianca. His sister stood on the front steps of the estate wearing black. Of course she was wearing black. with just enough wind to make her hair move cinematically. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though Cliff couldn't tell if that was genuine emotion or the onion trick he'd seen actresses use. Silas stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that read as support but looked like ownership. "My brother was a complicated man," Bianca said, her voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "But he was my brother. He raised me after our parents died. He gave me everything." A pause for a delicate sob. "I can't believe he's gone." "Liar," Cliff whispered. His paralyzed legs suddenly felt like a blessing because otherwise he might have tried to stand, to throw something, to shatter the screen showing his sister's performance. The reporter pressed closer with a microphone. "There are rumors that Mr. Rains had enemies. Can you speak to that?" Silas stepped forward, his expression grave, every inch the loyal advisor thrust into tragedy. Cliff made difficult decisions in his business dealings. Not everyone agreed with his methods. But to suggest that someone would... He stopped, apparently overcome. "We're cooperating fully with law enforcement. That's all I can say right now." "Cooperating with law enforcement he owns," Mary said quietly. Captain Reed was the first person Silas bought. Probably before they even planted the bomb. The broadcast cut to footage from earlier in the day. A press conference, formal with microphones crowding a podium. Silas stood at the center, now dressed in a dark suit that Cliff recognized. It was one of his own from his closet, probably still warm from Silas's treachery. Bianca stood beside him, her hand resting on a stack of documents. "The Rains organization will continue," Silas announced, his voice steady and authoritative. "Clifford built something larger than one man. In accordance with his documented wishes and the emergency succession protocols he himself established, I'm assuming operational control of all business entities until the estate can be properly settled." "Documented wishes?" Cliff's voice rose. "I never." "He forged them," Mary said. "Probably had them ready for months. Your signature isn't that complicated if you have access to original documents, which Silas had plenty of." The camera panned to show the assembled press corps hungry for details. One reporter called out, "What about the rumors of a power struggle? There are reports that Mr. Rains was planning to restructure his organization before his death." Silas's expression turned sympathetic, almost pitying. Cliff was under enormous stress in recent months. His behavior had become erratic. Some of us were concerned about his judgment. He paused meaningfully. There were discussions about intervention, but tragically we ran out of time. "He's building a narrative," Mary said. "Painting you as unstable. So if you come back from the dead, he can claim you faked your death due to mental breakdown. Or that you're an imposter trying to capitalize on tragedy. Either way, he's already poisoned the well." Bianca leaned into the microphone, her voice soft but clear. "My brother gave his life building this empire. The best way we can honor his memory is by protecting what he created. Silas has my complete trust and support." The way she looked at Silas when she said it, the subtle lean, the hand that brushed against his arm, told Cliff everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about money or power. Bianca and Silas were together, had probably been together for months, maybe years, plotting while Cliff signed papers and inhaled poison and walked past Mary Shirley without ever seeing her. "How long do you think they were planning this?" Cliff asked, his voice hollow. "Long enough to be patient. Long enough to get every detail right." Mary turned off the television, plunging the lighthouse back into lamplit shadows. "Your sister is good at this. She's not just grieving, she's auditioning for the role of tragic heiress maintaining her brother's legacy. By next week, there'll be a foundation in your name. Scholarships for underprivileged youth probably. Something photogenic. She hated charity work. She hated you more." Mary sat down across from him, her silver eyes reflecting the lamplight. "The question is, what are you going to do about it? You can't just walk into a police station and announce you're alive. They own the police. You can't go public without proof of the conspiracy. And right now, you're a man with paralyzed legs hiding in a condemned lighthouse with a maid whose father you wrongfully imprisoned." Cliff stared at the blank screen, seeing Bianca's false tears burned into his retinas. "They think I'm dead. That's an advantage." "Or a cage," Mary countered. "The longer you stay dead, the deeper they dig in. But move too soon, and you're just a crazy man with paranoid delusions about his loyal family. Silas has played this perfectly." Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the rain. The search hadn't stopped. Somewhere out there, men loyal to Silas were still looking for a body that didn't exist, insurance against the possibility that Cliff had somehow survived. Mary moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. "They're widening the search grid," she said. "Eventually they'll come here." Cliff looked down at his useless legs, then back at the blank television screen. "Then we'd better make sure I can stand before they do." The sound came 3 days later, just after dawn when the fog was thickest. Not the distant thrum of helicopters or the wail of sirens that had become background noise. This was closer. Deliberate. The crunch of boots on gravel moving slowly up the path toward the lighthouse. Mary's hand clamped over Cliff's mouth before he could speak. She'd been changing the dressing on his legs. He'd regained some sensation, enough to feel pins and needles like thousands of insects crawling under his skin. But now she froze, her entire body going rigid with the alertness of prey. One finger pressed to her lips. The universal language of survival. Silence or death. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Pause. Then the sound of someone testing the handle, finding it locked, and muttering a curse that carried through the salt-warped wood. Mary moved with a speed that contradicted everything Cliff thought he knew about her. She grabbed a tire iron from behind the camp stove, when had she placed that there, and positioned herself flat against the wall beside the door. Her blue uniform blended into the shadows, her brown skin barely visible in the dim morning light. She became what she'd always been, invisible. The door rattled harder. Whoever was outside wasn't being subtle anymore. Metal scraped against metal, a lockpick or pry bar, and the old mechanism gave way with a groan that seemed impossibly loud. The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of fog and salt air. The man who stepped inside wore tactical gear that Cliff recognized. Black cargo pants, utility vest, the kind of boots designed for rough terrain. One of Silas's crew, probably ex-military, the type Cliff had hired to patrol his estate perimeter before those same men had been turned against him. The man carried a pistol low and ready, his eyes scanning the room in methodical sweeps. "Abandoned my ass," the man muttered, noting the camp stove, the medical supplies, the cot where Cliff sat paralyzed and helpless. "Control, this is Scout 7. I've got activity at the condemned lighthouse. Looks like someone's been." Mary hit him from behind with the tire iron. Not a wild swing but a precise strike to the base of the skull, exactly where the spine met the cranium. The man dropped like his strings had been cut, the pistol clattering across the floor. His radio squawked with a response. "Scout 7, repeat your last. Did you say activity?" Mary scooped up the radio and smashed it against the stone floor, the plastic casing shattering into pieces. Then she was moving again, checking the man's pulse, rifling through his pockets with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. She pulled out a phone, a backup radio, car keys, and a wallet. Everything went into a pile on the metal table. "Is he dead?" Cliff asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not yet." Mary dragged the unconscious man toward a corner, her slender frame somehow managing the dead weight through sheer determination. "But he called it in. They know someone's here. We have maybe 10 minutes before backup arrives. Maybe less if they were already close. We can't move." "I still can't." "I know." Mary was already throwing supplies into a canvas bag. Water bottles, medical supplies, the remaining food. Her movements were precise, practiced, like she'd rehearsed this evacuation 100 times in her mind. "There's a service tunnel under the lighthouse, leads to an old storm shelter about half a mile down the coast. It's going to be tight and you're going to have to crawl, but it's our only option." She pulled up a section of floorboards Cliff had assumed were fixed, revealing a narrow opening and the top of a rusted ladder descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was stagnant water and decay, but also salvation. "What about him?" Cliff gestured to the unconscious scout. Mary glanced back at the man, her expression unreadable. "I'll tie him up, gag him. By the time he wakes up and they find him, we'll be gone." She paused, meeting Cliff's eyes. "Unless you're suggesting something else?" Cliff understood what she was asking. A dead man couldn't report what he'd found. Couldn't identify Mary. Couldn't lead Silas's crew to their next location. It would be easy. The man was already unconscious. A pillow over the face or a second blow with the tire iron. The devil of the coast had ordered worse for less provocation. "Tie him up," Cliff said quietly. "He's just following orders." Probably doesn't even know why he's looking for me. Something flickered in Mary's expression. Surprise maybe, or possibly disappointment. She didn't argue, just moved efficiently, using rope from her supplies to bind the man's hands and feet, stuffing a gag made from torn cloth into his mouth. She worked quickly, professionally, and Cliff realized this woman had depths he'd never imagined, skills that went far beyond serving breakfast and pressing shirts. "Can you use your arms?" Mary asked, returning to help him. "Enough. Then start moving. I'll lower the supplies, then seal the tunnel behind us." She helped him to the edge of the opening, his legs dragging uselessly. "The ladder's only 10 feet. Once you're down there's a platform. Wait there." Cliff gripped the ladder's sides and began lowering himself, his arms trembling with effort, his useless legs banging against the rungs. Above, he heard Mary making final preparations, the sound of floorboards being repositioned, the scrape of furniture being dragged, covering their tracks. When she finally descended, pulling the trapdoor closed above her and plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by a small LED flashlight clamped between her teeth, Cliff heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple engines. Silas's backup had arrived. "Move," Mary whispered, already crawling past him into the tunnel that stretched ahead like a throat waiting to swallow them. "And pray this passage doesn't flood at high tide, because if it does, we're going to drown in the dark." Cliff followed, dragging his paralyzed legs behind him, and wondered how many times a man could be stripped of his pride before there was nothing left but survival. The storm shelter was exactly what its name promised. Shelter, nothing more. A concrete box buried in the hillside 20 feet by 15, with a ceiling so low Cliff could touch it if he could stand. Which he couldn't, so the claustrophobia remained theoretical. Water seeped through cracks in the foundation, pooling in corners that stank of mold and rust. A single battery-powered lantern provided light that turned their faces into masks of shadow and exhaustion. But they were alive. The tunnel hadn't flooded. Silas's crew had found an empty lighthouse and an unconscious scout who could only report that someone had been there but was gone. For now that was enough. "We stay here 3 days, Mary announced, organizing their meager supplies on a sheet of plastic she'd spread across the driest section of floor. "Let them finish searching the immediate area. Then we move again." "Move where?" "Somewhere they've already looked. Somewhere they'll assume is clear." She didn't elaborate, and Cliff had learned not to push when Mary's jaw set in that particular way. She'd gotten them this far. He was in no position to question her strategy. On the second day, sensation returned to Cliff's legs with a vengeance. Not the gentle pins and needles of earlier, but white-hot bolts of pain that made him gasp and curl into himself. Mary watched him suffer with clinical detachment, checking his reflexes with her fingers, testing his responses to stimulus. "The nerves are regenerating," she said, pressing her thumb into the arch of his foot. Cliff's toes flexed involuntarily, and the triumph in Mary's eyes was more rewarding than any business deal he'd ever closed. "It's going to hurt worse before it gets better. That's how you know it's working." By the third day, Cliff could wiggle his toes on command. By the fourth, he could bend his knees, though the effort left him shaking and nauseous. Mary pushed him relentlessly, giving him exercises that felt designed to humiliate, leg lifts that barely cleared an inch, attempts to stand that ended with him collapsed against the wall, gasping like a fish drowning in air. "Again," Mary would say, her voice carrying no sympathy, no encouragement, just expectation. "You want to walk back into your world and take it from Silas? Then stand up. Prove you're not just a man who relied on other people's legs to carry him." The observation cut deeper than the physical pain. Cliff had always had people, guards to intimidate, lawyers to negotiate, advisors to implement. He'd never had to rely solely on himself, never had to rebuild from nothing with only his own strength. Now, in this concrete tomb that smelled of failure and mildew, he was learning what it meant to have no one but a woman who hated him and a body that refused to obey. On the 7th day, Mary decided it was time. They left the storm shelter under cover of darkness, Mary supporting Cliff's weight as his legs shook with the effort of walking. Not far, maybe a quarter-mile, to another abandoned structure, this one an old cannery at the edge of the industrial district. Mary had the keys, which meant she'd planned this too, had probably spent years mapping safe houses throughout the city while Cliff signed papers and never wondered where his invisible maid went on her days off. The cannery had stairs. Concrete stairs leading up 3 stories to offices that overlooked the empty processing floor. Mary took one look at those stairs, then at Cliff, and her expression became something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "This is where you learn to stand," she said. "Every morning you're going to climb these stairs. First time you'll make it maybe 3 steps before you collapse. But every day you'll go further. And when you can climb all 3 flights without stopping, that's when you'll be ready." Ready for what? To stop being a victim and start being the devil of the coast again. Mary started up the stairs, not looking back to see if he followed. "Assuming that's still who you want to be." Cliff gripped the rusted railing and pulled himself up 1 step. His legs screamed in protest, muscles that had atrophied during his paralysis now forced to bear weight they'd forgotten how to carry. 1 step became 2. 2 became 3. On the 4th step his knee buckled and he crashed down, catching himself on his forearms, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue. Mary appeared above him, looking down without offering a hand. "Get up. I need a minute." "Silas isn't giving you a minute. Bianca isn't waiting for you to feel ready. Your empire is being carved up and distributed while you're lying on stairs feeling sorry for yourself." Her silver eyes reflected the dim light filtering through broken windows. "So get up or admit you're exactly who they thought you were. A man who relied on fear and money because he never had the spine to rely on himself." Cliff pushed himself up, trembling, and took another step. Then another. He made it to step 7 before collapsing again, his breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold. Over the following days, the stairs became his nemesis and his salvation. Mary timed him, marked his progress with pieces of chalk on the wall. 7 steps the first day, 11 the second, 18 the third. She showed no mercy, pushed him past the point where his muscles failed and into the territory where will was the only thing keeping him moving. But she also taught him. During rest periods she explained how she'd survived 4 years in his house. How she'd learned to read people by watching their feet. You could tell more from someone's stance than their face. How she'd cultivated the kitchen staff by remembering their children's names, their birthdays, the small details people thought no one noticed. How she'd turned invisibility into a superpower, moving through Cliff's world like a ghost while mapping every weakness, every crack in the foundation. "You ruled through fear," Mary said one evening as Cliff nursed his burning legs. "But fear only works on people who believe you can hurt them. The truly dangerous people, the ones like me, we learned to exist in the spaces where you weren't looking. That's where your empire fell apart, Mr. Rains. Not because Silas was smarter or Bianca was more ruthless. But because you never understood that the people you didn't see were the ones who could destroy you." On the 14th day, Cliff climbed all 3 flights without stopping. His legs shook, his lungs burned, and he collapsed at the top like he'd summit Everest. But he'd made it. Mary stood at the bottom, watching, and when their eyes met across the distance, something passed between them that wasn't quite trust but wasn't entirely animosity either. "Now you're ready," she said quietly. "Now we can begin." The charity gala was Bianca's idea, which made it perfect for Cliff's purposes. 3 weeks after his supposed death, his sister was hosting a fundraiser at the Harbor Pavilion, in memory of Clifford Rains, with proceeds going to coastal preservation. The irony wasn't lost on Cliff. He'd spent 20 years destroying that coastline for profit, and now Bianca would profit from pretending to save it. Mary had procured formal wear from somewhere, clothes that fit well enough to pass inspection but carried no labels, nothing traceable. Cliff stood in front of a cracked mirror in the cannery's office, barely recognizing the man staring back. Thinner, harder, with a beard he'd grown during recovery that changed the shape of his face. But it was the eyes that were different. They'd lost the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to his will. What remained was something sharper, more dangerous. The eyes of someone who died and clawed his way back. "You don't have to do this," Mary said from the doorway. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a way that emphasized those silver eyes. For once she wasn't wearing her maid's uniform. She looked like someone Cliff might have noticed if he'd ever bothered to look. "We could wait. Build a case. Use legal channels. My sister is giving a speech tonight about my legacy. Silas will be standing beside her, wearing my authority like a stolen suit." Cliff adjusted his tie, noting how his hands no longer trembled. The toxin was gone, flushed from his system by Mary's remedies and sheer stubborn will. "I'm not waiting for justice to catch up. I'm delivering it personally. They arrived separately, Mary through the service entrance where staff moved like ghosts, Cliff through the main doors like a man who'd never learned to hide. The pavilion was everything he'd expected: crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, the city's elite dressed in their moral superiority, writing checks to assuage guilt they'd never truly feel. Bianca held court at the center of it all, radiant in designer black, accepting condolences with practiced grace. Silas worked the room beside her, shaking hands, making promises, consolidating the empire they'd stolen. No one noticed the bearded man in the ill-fitting tuxedo watching from the periphery. No one except Mary, who moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, invisible again, positioned perfectly between Cliff and any security that might recognize him. The speech began at 8. Bianca took the podium with tears already threatening, a masterclass in manufactured emotion. My brother believed in this city, she began, her voice carrying across the room with crystalline clarity. He believed in building something that would outlast him. And though he's gone, I'm not. Cliff's voice cut through the pavilion like a gunshot. Conversations died. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Every head turned toward the back of the room where Cliff stood, very much alive, very much not a ghost. Bianca's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, horror, rage, calculation, before settling on something that might have passed for joy in poor lighting. Cliff. Oh my God, Cliff. She moved toward him, arms outstretched for an embrace that would have been touching if Cliff didn't know she'd been counting his money while planning his funeral. Stop, Cliff said quietly, and something in his voice made her freeze. Everyone in this room needs to hear something. 3 weeks ago my car exploded in my driveway. I was supposed to be in it. I would have been, except Mary Shirley saved my life. He gestured toward Mary, who set down her tray and stepped forward, shedding her invisible status like a snake shedding skin. The woman you never noticed. The maid you walked past 1,000 times. She pulled me into a closet while Silas and Bianca celebrated my death in my own home. While they discussed the success of the neurotoxin they'd been poisoning me with for 3 months. That's insane, Silas said, but his hand moved toward his jacket, toward where Cliff knew he kept a pistol. You're clearly unwell. The trauma of the accident. There was no accident. There was a bomb triggered by a detonator you held, Silas. I saw it through the closet door. I heard every word. Cliff pulled out a small recording device. Mary's work, salvaged from the lighthouse before they fled. And I recorded your performance for the police. The real police, not the ones you bought. Movement at the exits. Captain Reed's replacement, a woman named Santos who Silas hadn't gotten to yet, entered with a squad of officers. Mary had made the call 3 hours ago, had delivered the evidence, had ensured that this moment would be more than just theater. Bianca lunged, not toward Cliff but toward the nearest exit, her survival instinct finally overriding her performance. She made it 5 steps before Mary stepped into her path with the casual efficiency of someone who'd spent 4 years studying every possible move. Bianca went down hard, Mary's knee in her back, and for the first time in weeks, Cliff heard his sister's real voice. Not the practiced sympathy or manufactured grief but raw fury. You were nothing, Bianca spat. You were a tyrant playing king and I would have been better. Maybe you would have been, Cliff said quietly, watching the officers secure both Silas and his sister in handcuffs. But you chose poison and bombs instead of confrontation. You chose to kill me rather than challenge me. That's not strength, Bianca. That's cowardice with a detonator. Later, after the arrests, after the statements, after the pavilion had emptied of everyone except crime scene technicians and lawyers scrambling to understand what had just happened, Cliff found Mary standing at the harbor's edge, watching the lights reflect off black water. I have the pardon ready to sign, he said, producing the documents he'd drafted with attorneys who owed him favors too old to be corrupted. And the statement clearing your father. He'll be released within 48 hours. Mary took the papers, read them carefully in the dock lights, then looked up at Cliff. What happens now? You have your empire back. You've had your revenge. I've served my purpose. I don't want the empire back. Not the way it was. Cliff stared out at the water where he'd conducted business through fear and violence, where he'd built power on the backs of people he'd never bothered to see. I want to build something different. Something that doesn't require poison to maintain. And I can't do that alone. I'm not your mate anymore, Mr. Raines. I know. I'm asking you to be my partner. Cliff met her silver eyes. Not because you saved my life. Not because I owe you a debt I can never repay. But because you see things I'm blind to. You notice the invisible people. You understand that true power isn't in fear. It's in knowing who's in the room and why they're there. Mary was quiet for a long moment, the papers in her hands rustling in the harbor breeze. My father gets out first. Then we talk terms. Agreed. She extended her hand and Cliff shook it, feeling the calluses from 4 years of work he'd never acknowledged, the strength in fingers that had kept him alive when everyone else wanted him dead. This wasn't the grip of a servant. This was the handshake of an equal. The devil of the coast was dead. What remained was something harder to define, something built in lighthouse shadows and cannery stairs, something that understood the difference between ruling through fear and earning through respect. And standing beside him was the ghost who'd decided he was worth saving, no longer invisible, no longer waiting in the margins. Mary surely had her own power now, and Cliff suspected the city would never be the same. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices, until it's too late. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about second chances, about the invisible people who see everything, and about how true power isn't built on fear but on the strength to rebuild yourself from nothing. One subscribe means the world to me and helps me bring you more stories like this. Stories where the maid becomes the mastermind, where the fallen king learns humility, and where justice comes from the most unexpected places. Thank you so much for watching. Your support truly means everything to me. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It only takes a second but helps immensely in bringing you more content like this. I've got another compelling video ready for you. Just click on it now to continue. See you in the next one.